Welcome, everyone, to today's discussion about workplace safety in this almost post pandemic era. You know, most employers spend considerable time and considerable investment to assure the safety of all of their constituents, their employees and customers alike, from known risks. But one of the startling realities we're going to take a deep dive into this morning is the risks associated with intimate partner violence among employees on workplace safety. You know, the Department of Labor in 2017 issued a report that indicated that 27%, more than a quarter of workplace violence incidents have a precursor in domestic violence. And in speaking with so many employers over time, well, one thing we have learned is that when you have experienced the death or assault of an employee at the hands of a current or former partner, you as an individual are forever changed. You never see your workplace safety the same way again. What you learn from that kind of awful experience is that the time to plan is now before it occurs. Because when the risk is at your doorstep, the plan has to be in place. We are delighted today to be joined by some incredible professionals who have generously contributed their time and expertise to our effort to prevent this kind of incident from occurring. Kevin Wilkes is the Chief Security Officer for the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust. He is charged with the safety of trust venues across the city, their audiences, and their employees alike. Joining Kevin today is Sean Brokaus, who joined the Jewish Federation of Pittsburgh as its Director of Community Safety in January 2020 after retiring from the FBI after 24 years of service. And I am pleased also that Susan DiGregorio, our Senior Account Executive and resident attorney here at Standing Firm, has joined us to conclude with some important thoughts about OSHA with regards to workplace safety and domestic violence. Susan brings more than 30 years of national and international benefits consulting experience to her work with Standing Firm and to our discussion here today. So before we get started, we ask that questions or comments be placed in the chat, which we will monitor throughout the presentation. We hope to have a few minutes at the end of the hour together for some questions and discussion. So I ask that you remain muted throughout the formal presentation and unmute yourself only if you are speaking. You will receive an evaluation survey immediately following the webinar today. Please feel free to add to the comments section any questions of our speakers that we don't have time to get to this morning. We will make every effort to respond to all of them in a group follow-up email. Today's webinar is being recorded. So Kevin, I'd like to turn over the screen to you.
Your employee. It means it's time for your employees to start to return to the workplace. In some form or fashion, in some shape, it's time to return to the workplace, to the new normal. Whether they're coming back full-time, whether they're coming back part-time or hybrid time, it's time to return to the workplace. So what does that look like? What does that mean for many of your employees who have been away from the workplace for perhaps well over a year? Well, it means fear. It means anxiety. What is it going to be like for me when I return to the workplace after being away for a year? Is it safe? Is the disease dynamic of COVID, is it really as low? Is it really coming down as quickly or as much as everyone says? What are the new office dynamics going to be like? Will I be sitting in the same location? Will I be sitting in a different location? What steps has my employer taken to make sure that I'm safe while I'm in the office? Family concerns. Well, now that I have to return to the workplace, who's going to take care of my children? Who's going to provide them with childcare? Who's going to take care of my ailing or elderly parents? These are all new family concerns that I'm now forced to juggle and try to manage as I re-enter the workplace. Renewed expectations. What will the expectations of my employer be once I return to the workplace? Will they expect my productivity to go up, to go down, to stay the same after a year of being away from the office? And commuting. Well, hey, when I was working home because of COVID, I didn't have to worry about that hour or that hour and a half commute into the office at the beginning of the day and back home from the office at the end of the day. And what are the new workforce dynamics going to look like? My fellow coworkers, my fellow friends that I used to work with, how many of them will still be there when I return to the workplace? Or have they moved on perhaps to other opportunities? Expenses. Well, when I was working from home, I was able to reduce my expenses related to childcare, my expenses related to going out to lunch or bringing my lunch into the workplace every day, and then parking. Well, when I worked from home, I didn't have to worry about trying to find a place to park in the morning when I arrived to the workplace, nor did I have to worry about that $300, $400, $500 monthly expense for a parking lease. And then what's my new work-life balance going to be? I was able to work from home. I was able to successfully demonstrate to my employer that I can produce, I can get all of my work done while at the same time providing care for my family. And also the convenience that working from home gave all of us in this new world of Zoom, in the new world of COVID. So all of these are adjustments, major, significant adjustments that many of your employees will be forced to make when they return to the workplace. So what does all this mean? Well, it means stress. It means stress. So next slide, Molly, please. So today, what I hope to do is to give you a new view, if I can. And remember that word, view, a new perspective of how these stressors can significantly enhance the workplace risk for some of your most valued employees. And so what's that risk? Well, that risk is intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And now you may ask, well, Kevin, where's the risk? Well, according to OSHA, the workplace means any place where a person is able to perform their agency's work or the operations performed by their agency. So that means if I'm located downtown in my company's office, my corporate headquarters, along with 300 of my fellow coworkers, is that considered my workplace? So, excuse me, Molly, next slide, please. I'm sorry, Molly, let's go back to the previous slide. I apologize. Thank you. So is that considered to be my workplace? Well, absolutely. Of course it is. Now, what if I'm working from home, from my home office, all alone? Is that considered to be my workplace? Well, according to OSHA, it is. And that means as an employer, you've got some responsibility to identify risks that can be likely to cause harm or death to an employee. Risks like intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And then as an employer, you also have an obligation to take steps to mitigate those recognized risks. So what all this means is that we as employers have to be vigilant. We have to be vigilant. And that means we have to be vigilant under OSHA's general duty clause. Now, in a few moments, Susan's going to share some information with you about OSHA's general duty clause. And I don't want to steal any of her thunder, but believe me, you want to pay close attention to what exactly that means for you in your workplace. Next slide, Molly. Thank you. So, and just as a friendly reminder, listen, if you still think OSHA is a small town in Wisconsin, well, boy, you're in big trouble, because believe me, this is one organization, meaning OSHA, that you don't want to find neglect or wrongdoing with your employee practices, because it sets the stage. It sets the stage for worse things to follow. Folks, you have to be vigilant, and you have to have the ability to be introspective, the ability to understand when you have a potential intimate partner violence situation right at your doorstep. So with that being said, let's get a good, hard, clear definition of what intimate partner violence is defined as by the CDC. Intimate partner violence is a serious, preventable public health problem that affects millions of Americans. The term intimate partner violence describes physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, or psychological harm by a current or former partner or spouse. This type of abuse can occur between heterosexual or same-sex couples or ex-partners, and it does not require sexual intimacy. Folks, if you only have one takeaway from my time with you this morning, please let it be this. These intimate partner violence situations can be prevented. They absolutely can be prevented if you're willing to engage. And that means every employee. That means every employee in your organization engaging from the top to the bottom, no matter how large your organization is. Next slide, Molly. Thank you. Because if you're not willing to engage, then here's the risks that could potentially impact your organization. Let's start off with liability, violations of the general duty clause by OSHA, or perhaps its findings of fault or guilt in a civil or criminal court. Financial loss perhaps by OSHA imposed fines, negligent security, or wrongful death lawsuits. Not to mention the loss that's associated with reputational damage or damage to your brand of who you are in the marketplace, or perhaps a lack of confidence in your company by your employees and other key stakeholders, which could very well lead to workplace disruptions, a lack of productivity, declining morale in the workplace, all of which absolutely impacts employee health and well-being. But none of these more so than the possible preventable harm or death that could befall an employee through a lack of organizational engagement. Next slide, Molly. Thank you. So let's talk about solutions. Let's talk about possible solutions. And as you look at these slides, I want you to think of the first three bullets as your quick three. Again, think of these first three bullets as your quick three. And what I mean by that, these will be your quick three in terms of auditing what you have in place to address intimate partner violence in your organization. First, policies. Do you even have a workplace violence prevention policy? And if so, does it address restraining orders, protection orders, PFAs? And I have to honestly admit, it probably doesn't, because most policies that I've seen fail to unfortunately address this very important section of a workplace violence policy that's designed to protect the victim of intimate partner violence, your employees. And also at the same time, it's designed to protect the workplace as well. Okay? Let's say you do have a policy. How many people in your organization even know that you have a policy? Is it part of your onboarding process? Do you offer annual employee awareness and education programs? And do you even offer specific training or awareness or enhanced education for your supervisors so they are better able to identify the signs that are associated with intimate partner violence? Okay? And then, heaven forbid, response procedures. What's your plan? What do you do if you come face to face with an intimate partner violence situation in your workplace? What's your plan to respond to a new or developing incident? What's your plan to respond to a major incident? And while we're talking about plans, I know it's a cliche, but it is a cliche for a reason. Those who fail to plan plan to fail, and safety plans. What is your most important plan? The plan to ensure the safety of an intimate partner violence victim in your workplace, again, your employees. And if you don't have a safety plan already set in place to spin up when these unfortunate situations may evolve, then guess what? Today's your lucky day, because in just a few moments, Sean is going to share an absolutely fantastic outline with you of a solid workplace intimate violence protection safety plan to better ensure the protection of your employees who may find themselves victims of IPV. So remember these solutions, folks. In order for these solutions to work, whether it's policies in the workplace, workforce awareness and education, response procedures, or safety plans, it's all about engagement. It's about commitment from the top down. And if you want these solutions to work, then you have to engage. And please, again, remember as the first three, as your quick three, in terms of auditing what you already have in your workplace to address intimate partner violence. Next slide, Molly. Thank you. So as we look out across the risk landscape, we already know that we have to be more vigilant. We already know that we have to be more introspective, that we have to be able to understand when something wrong is occurring that may have a possible intimate partner violence connection that we're attempting to manage. And if we're attempting to manage this situation, then we have to be prepared to engage. We have to be prepared to engage with our policies, with our procedures, with our training. And if that's the case, then lastly, you also have to be willing. You have to be willing to do the hard work to build your team to tackle this issue. Now listen, this team should not be built in a silo, nor should it fall squarely and solely on the shoulders of the HR professionals in your workplace. Although these HR professionals may be tasked to lead these efforts, it should not rest entirely with them. So, in order for these plans and for this team to really be successful and to develop a holistic and comprehensive approach that's both nimble enough and that can also quickly pivot to address the dynamic set of circumstances that often accompany issues of intimate partner violence in the workplace, the team should be comprised of a multidisciplinary group of both internal and external stakeholders. So, of course, who do we want on our team? We absolutely have to have the strength of our HR leaders, our HR professionals in the workplace. We also want to make sure that we have legal involved, whether it's inside counsel or outside counsel. We also want to have the expertise of security practitioners. Perhaps you have that skill set already in-house, or if not, perhaps an outside security consultant or security practitioner that can advise you. Also, local law enforcement partners when it's available and when it's applicable. Also, we want to lean on outside mental health professionals for that clinical view in terms of helping us to better understand and identify risks. And then also, shelters and domestic violence advocates are extremely huge and beneficial resources, not only for your organization, but to also already have them on board, have them on deck for the victims of intimate partner violence. And then, of course, most importantly, executive leadership. Executive leadership will set the tone, and they'll also create the buy-in for the rest of the organization. Next slide, Molly. Thank you. So let's recap and hopefully take a look at your new view of intimate partner violence. View, V-I-E-W, the V, vigilance. As an organization, we have to become more aware of this risk, and that we have to know that this risk does exist and can exist, whether it's in a corporate office space with hundreds of people or alone. in a home office with yourself and a significant other. I, introspection. We have to be able to understand and identify what intimate partner violence looks like. And then E, engagement. Engagement of our policies, engagement of our procedures, engagement of our training and our awareness, and of course, our safety plans. And then lastly, W, willingness. There has to be a willingness to do the hard work, a willingness to build your team, a willingness to address these problems, and a willingness to mitigate your risk for intimate partner violence in your organization. Thanks, Molly.
Kevin, thank you so much for providing that kind of organization to what can really feel overwhelming. I want to turn, though, quickly to Sean Brokos, who is going to go a little more deeply into organizational readiness, as well as being prepared to support an individual. Sean?
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everybody. As Beth said, I came to my current position, which is Director of Community Security for the Jewish Federation, after 24 years in law enforcement. Specifically, I was with the FBI in Newark, New Jersey, and then I transferred to Pittsburgh in 2013 and finished my career there. The bulk of the work I did, aside from being a criminal investigative agent, was planning, preparing, and responding to critical incidents. And as Kevin said, and I love this term, and we use this frequently, those who fail to plan to fail. And today, what I want to talk about is the importance of planning, the importance of preparation, and the ability to respond. A crisis situation is always difficult, but if we plan in advance, if we have policies in place, if we train for them, and at the end of the day, if we care and show our workforce we care, it will certainly help a difficult situation go more smoothly. I know this from experience. I was tasked early in my career to write what we call a child abduction response plan, meaning if there was a kidnapping, what does that plan look like? And then when I got to our Pittsburgh, I say that looking out the window because our Pittsburgh FBI office is across the river here. When I got to Pittsburgh, I was tasked with writing what's called a crisis response plan. So that meant if there was any type of critical event, to include mass shooting, to include our response to the Tree of Life attack, to include, again, a kidnapping, abduction, officer-involved shooting. We wrote those plans, we trained on those plans, we prepared. And so I cannot stress again how important it is, because during a crisis is not the time to figure out where do I go or what do I do. So how do we get there? Let me back up a bit and say my role with the Jewish Federation as Director of Community Security is somewhat similar to what I did at the FBI. I am tasked with ensuring the security and safety of members of Jewish Pittsburgh. We have over 50 organizations here. So that means certainly physical infrastructure, right? Are there appropriate doors in place, windows, fences, gates, access control, the things in our physical security world that are so, so important. I'm also tasked with threat mitigation. And currently, as I'm sure you're aware of, seen in the news, there is an absolute rise in anti-Semitic rhetoric and attacks on Jewish people. And so it's vetting those threats, working through them, and coordinating that police response. Thirdly, a lot of what I do is what I call emergency response training, active threat training, and life-saving training, CPR, and stop the bleed, those types of things. Today is not active threat training, but I am going to spend a few minutes talking about it because, as Beth said when she introduced us, there is a tremendous correlation between active threats, active shooters, and domestic violence. So I want to just clarify a term I use. We typically in law enforcement historically use the term active shooter. We have now changed that to active threat because not all mass attacks are done with a handgun, long gun weapon. They are done as well with knives or vehicles. So if you hear me say active threat, behind most of it, I will say is active shooter. So I just wanted to clarify that. But it's very important that we look at the history and the current threat tempo of these active threats, because that will help us plan and prepare for violence in the workplace. So I want to talk about, with all of that in the backdrop, I want to talk about really why should we care? And where is our threat tempo now? And how do we best prepare for that? And there is no more important time than right now, as we face some of the highest incidents of mass shootings ever in our country's history, and as we look to return to the workplace. As Kevin mentioned, anxiety is high for all of us. We're all trying to transition back to the office or back to hybrid, and we have those daily life stressors. Anxiety is already high. And then, Beth, yesterday morning, turning on the news, almost every day, the news comes on to another active shooter, active threat incident, another source of anxiety. Add to that the complications with COVID. As Kevin said, hopefully we're in a much better place, but it is still rifled with anxiety. So I want to start with a couple things we know to transition to better talking about safety plans and preparation for the workplace. First and foremost, we know domestic violence walks through the doors of whether our homes, but for today's purposes, our workplaces every day. And if you look to the screen on the right, there is a photo of the police response to an active shooter incident that happened April 16th in Canton, Ohio, right across the border. There was a man who walked into Bob Evans and shot and killed his partner, a waitress who was working there. She saw him coming. She ran in fear to the back of the restaurant. She was unable to get away. That's just an example of how domestic violence walks through our doors every day. We know that the assailant tracks down the partner, whether they're at home and at work. And I put at work in capital there because that's what today is about. The assailant will track down the victim. Again, maybe at home, but also at work. What we know, there have been nearly, and this statistic is probably even dated given the past couple of days, but there's been nearly 200 mass shootings in this year alone. We are on par to have the highest record of mass shootings in our country's history. Molly, if you can go to the next slide, please. Some more of what we know. I want to at least preface this and say that the statistics I'm referencing are based on a study that Boston University did. And what they did was explore mass shooting incidents from 1996 to 2000, a total of 769. And what they saw was that, per their statistics, 50% of active shooters have a history of violence against women. That violence could be either in the form of intimate partner violence or sex assault. We saw through their study that 60% of these incidents, these active shooter instances, were directed against a partner and or a family member and committed by men with a history of domestic violence. I want to be clear, I'm not singling out men. I'm not associating this with men. I want to say that these are the studies. And when we plan and prepare, what we do is go back and look at the data we have and the statistics we have, because that is going to form how we can best plan and prepare. So the picture on the right is from May 9th, and that was in Colorado Springs. And this was a domestic violence incident that turned into a mass shooting when a man who was upset that he wasn't invited to the birthday party fatally shot 6 people at this birthday party and then turned the gun on himself. I don't know that we need hundreds of examples to draw from to say that there is this correlation, but this is yet another recent example. And I have a few more just to really reiterate this point. Molly, if you could go to the next slide, please. Beth mentioned these, and my plan is to not spend time going into detail with these instances, but only to point out, again, the threat tempo is high and our workplaces are exposed. If you look at this time period, March 16th to April 15th, we had 54 mass shootings in the country that left 39 people dead, one of them a 9-year-old boy. We had the shooting at the FedEx office in Indianapolis that left 8 dead. Kentmore Cabinets in Texas, 1 dead. In Orange, California, the office building in which the 9-year-old boy was killed, 4 dead. Boulder, Colorado, the shooting in the grocery store that left 10 dead. And of course, the massage parlor mass shootings in Atlanta that left 8 dead. I can't sit here and tell you that there was an absolute 100% correlation to domestic violence in these incidents, but I can tell you there is a correlation. Molly, if you could actually go to my previous slide. So I know thank you. So I know I've gone through a lot of statistics with you and thrown out a lot of numbers and talked about where we sit now with our threat tempo. I want to shift gears though to talk about other things that we know. We know the threat tempo is high, but we know preparation works for active threats and workplace violence. We know that recognizing what is happening in our workplace, responding, having the ability to refer to resources, police, mental health counselors, and the ability to be flexible, we know that these things work. So I'm going to shift gears a bit and talk about 3 important topics. Knowing that planning and preparation are essential, how do we start doing that? First, we need to understand the abusive partner or employee. Second, we need to create a workplace safety plan so that when an employee reports a threat, whether against themselves or against a coworker, we know how to respond to this. And third, how do we create a personal workplace safety plan for an employee who is currently being threatened? And so those are the 3 topics I'm going to shift gears and focus on. So Molly, if you could just go to, not the next slide, but the one after that. Thank you very much. So recognizing the signs of an abusive partner employee, what I'll say to start with, there is no face of an abusive partner or employee. I talk about this a lot in my active threat training. I have people who ask, well, what does an active shooter look like? What should we be looking for? There is no face of this, but what there is a series of what we call red flag indicators. And those are signs. And we need, as employers and as friends, family members, we need to point these signs out. We need to be able to recognize them. We need to be able to talk to somebody about them. Some of the signs that we know of an abusive partner are extreme jealousy. A lot of domestic violence behavior is rooted in shame and lack of control. And I'm not going into the psychology of either domestic violence or active shooters, but we know an abusive partner, a lot of the backdrop relates to extreme jealousy and control. And it's because there is a lack of control in that person's environment. There is, again, the controlling behavior. If it's an employee who is saying, well, I can't go out to lunch with you, I can't go out and grab a drink with you, my partner won't let me. Controlling behavior. We've all seen it, and we've all tried to work with it. And I recognize it's very hard. But just knowing the signs are the first step to being able to work forward through this. There's threatening behavior. This will manifest itself in the workplace. A lot of people think of domestic violence as occurring behind closed doors at the home, but these personality traits manifest themselves in the workplace. So certainly threatening behavior, abrupt mood changes. That person may come into work happy and within 5 minutes be going on a tirade about something that has happened. You have these abrupt mood changes, the inability to regulate their behavior, and the propensity towards anger. Tied with that typically comes verbal abuse. You want to look for coworkers who really who are verbally abusive, whether it's to one another or whether it's to their partner. If you overhear a phone call or a discussion that maybe happened in the parking lot, breaking objects, throwing things, it ties back to that inability to regulate anger and emotion. And then history. Most of the abusive partners have some sort of history of acting out in the past, of being not per se arrested, but at least having had encounters that were very difficult. So looking for all of those signs, we need to teach and train our employees how to be aware of those. So that's step one. Step two becomes a lot more difficult. Now that we know the signs, we've recognized them, what are the challenges with those? Do we confront the person? And if so, who does that? Who from the office is tasked with that confrontation, if that's decided at the course of action? Is there the propensity for violence? Often there is. What happens if there is a confrontation and it becomes violent? What is the plan in the workplace for that? De-escalation, which is always a wonderful direction to head. Who does that? Who has been trained in de-escalation, active listening skills? Who is that person in your office? And if de-escalation is not possible, it's not going to work. That doesn't happen in all cases. Lastly, police response. At what point after confronting or engaging with this abusive partner or abusive employee, are you going to involve the police? These are all very difficult decisions. And this is where having a plan, and as Kevin said, having a team, it's not just one person. This is not done in a silo. This does not just fall in the lap of human resources. All of these things become so important, and planning and preparing for them in advance will help when this happens. Molly, if you could go to the next slide, please. So talking about workplace safety plans, how do you do this? How do you begin engaging? Or if you've already engaged, how do you modify this plan if needed? What do you look at? So first and foremost, again, identifying the team. This cannot just be human resources. This cannot just be security. I'm in security. I've worked in security, whether law enforcement or here in the Jewish community. I'm not familiar with compliance issues. I'm not familiar with the ins and outs of human resources. I can add my expertise in security, but I need to work with my human resources counterpart. I need to have that legal assistance and helping direct what can we do, what can we not do. We need to have a very strong employee assistance program in the workplace. And if you don't have these resources, I can tell you Standing Firm has them and has them available to get you started. So first and foremost, identify your team. I want to point out with this team, when you're building it, Make sure you pick folks who are available 24/7, because this is not going to happen in a vacuum. It's not going to happen timely. This could happen at off hours. And so whoever's on your team, they have to be readily available. They have to be dependable, and will pick up that cell phone, because again, a crisis never happens when you're expecting it. It's during those off hours and unexpected times. So I'll go on to reporting procedures. This should be something that is clear and concise to people. When do you report? It's not only that, but making sure that when people report, they are comfortable. They know there's an environment of trust, because what you're asking people to do is talk about the most intimate part of either their personal lives or a coworker's personal life. This is extremely sensitive, and it needs to be treated with the utmost of sensitivity. Employees need to feel comfortable in your workplace culture that they can report these incidences. What are the resources and services that are available? Again, if you don't have them in-house, refer to a standing firm to make sure you have resources on hand. Make sure you have services available. Disclosure, so important. Is the abuser somebody who has threatened himself, threatened others? At what point are you elevating this? And if you know you need to elevate it, how do you disclose? Again, this is something that your team needs to work through and have planned for. Documenting incidents. This needs to be done uniformly. This is not a la carte. You have to have a plan. You have to be consistent. How do you document these incidents? Because documenting them becomes essential. If this is going to be a criminal case or civil case, if it comes to that, you're going to need to go back to all your notes, discussions, phone calls, threats that may have come in, discussions you may have had. So be sure you have a very robust documentation procedure in place. Alternate work plans. Are you open to those at your job? Do you have that hybrid environment? Are you going to allow employees to work from different locations so as maybe to avoid the workplace if there's issues with that? At what point are you going to notify other employees that there is the potential for an active threat, or there is an abuser who could be a threat to the workplace? All very important parts of your workplace safety plan. Molly, if you want to go on to the next. So I want to talk about, before I get into this, the notion of flexibility. And I know Kevin mentioned the word introspective. And to me, I think it's synonymous with flexibility. As we build these plans, we have to have flexibility. This is not preparing for a bomb threat where you can pull out the checklist and say, okay, this is what I do. And there's that kind of cookbook approach to it. These plans need to be in place, but we have to have the amount of flexibility with them, because again, you're dealing with the inner workings of somebody's most personal parts of their lives. So have the plan, but please have that ability to be introspective, go back over it, be flexible. And that should be part, hopefully, of your workplace culture. So once you've identified an employee who is a victim of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, how do you help that employee? So a couple things to consider. What you want to do is work with that employee to make sure that they are safe. Make sure they're safe coming to work, leaving work. How are they getting in? Are they taking the bus to work? Where, if they're driving, where are they parking? If they walk, what door are they coming into? This is where your security folks really come into play, so they can keep an eye on these things. If that employee happens to sit somewhere by your front entrance, consider relocating that employee away from that entrance. If there is a specific identified threat, leave what's called a bolo, produce and create a bolo. Be on the lookout. We use those all the time in law enforcement. Be on the lookout. That's what that stands for. That is a simple one-page sheet that shows a photo of the individual, name, information, so that people at reception know that this individual has come in and they know to proceed with caution. So consider doing that. Talk about the leave provisions. Does that employee have enough annual leave or vacation time to use while they're trying to work through this incident? Again, I talk about documentation. This is absolutely critical. Make sure you're saving in voicemail threads, emails, social media posts. Make sure you're documenting all of these as time goes on. They will be needed, whether, again, it's a civil matter or criminal matter. Make sure that you are, if that employee has a protection from abuse or a restraining order, that you know about that and that you have it and you're prepared to respond. If that person, if the abuser has a protection from abuse, if the employee has that protection from abuse and the abuser comes to work, what do you do as the employer? And how do you engage the police? How do you execute on that? Are you going to make alternative work arrangements for your employee? Are you going to say, I recognize that being in the workplace right now is not safe for you. Perhaps being at your home is not safe for you. Perhaps you're living with friends, relatives, shelter, no matter where the case may be. Can that employee work using those alternative work arrangements? What happens if that employee does not show? What is the employer's response? Who do you call? How do you track that employee down? At what point do you ring those alarm bells, right? If it's an hour or two late, is that the point where you become concerned? Do you give it a day? Again, this is situation dependent. There is no magic answer. But make sure you have a plan for that if that employee does not show. Access to unemployment. If that individual is no longer able to work, can you guide them to the appropriate resources to begin unemployment? Make sure, and I end with resources, make sure you have resources. And I will also reiterate, there are no magic answers. There is no one size fits all. This is introspection, this is planning, this is the ability to be flexible. Behind it all is our need for absolute vigilance. And I want to just wrap up with a couple of things. One, workplace culture is so important. Victims of domestic violence, interpartner violence, are often feeling shame, humiliation. There is health issues at play, perhaps financial issues at play, and an overall very difficult situation. If they have a place that they can go to, an employer they can trust who will look out for them, that is very important. And it becomes a chain event, right? Because these active shooters, active threats, workplace violence, domestic violence is preventable. It takes vigilance, like Kevin said. It takes introspection, flexibility. It takes engagement. That means having those difficult discussions. That means training your workforce to see these signs and to have the comfort level in reporting. It takes willingness to engage. And it's all of those things that become so important. I talk about planning, preparation, responding, no matter what it is in life. Those are so important. So I will leave with this. I do a lot of training in the Jewish community, and I talk about anti-Semitism, and I talk about the awful mass shootings we've had as a result of anti-Semitic rhetoric. And I talk about the recent events that we're seeing. And one thing I say is, why should we care, right? If we're not Jewish, if I'm not Jewish, or if my audience is not Jewish, why should we care? Well, it's the same with domestic violence or inter-partner violence. You don't have to be Jewish to care about hate. You don't have to be a victim or intimately familiar with domestic violence or inter-partner violence. You have to just be somebody who cares. And if it starts at that very base level, we know we can have these difficult conversations. We know we can plan. We can build our team. We can prevent. And hopefully, collectively, at the end of the day, all of us together can help take us away from this awful trajectory of violence that we're headed towards and bring us down to more of a human level where we respect and treat each other with kindness. I know that's a bit of a Pollyanna hope, but that's something that I hope we can all do. And I thank you for being here today and participating in this. Molly, I'm sorry, Beth, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Sean. And I'm a devoted follower of idealism because I think we have to be positive and I think we have to have hope, and knowing what to do in order to cause the outcome that we look for is crucial. So thank you so much for sharing all of those details and all of the planning process that can put us in a safer position and help put our employees in a safer position. I'm going to turn now to Susan DiGregorio. Susan, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Beth, and good morning, everyone. Molly, if you could, thank you. You read my mind. So the last issue we want to explore today is an employer's legal responsibility to protect the safety of an employee who may be a victim of partner violence, or to protect the workplace and that individual's coworkers if there's a threat to the workplace resulting from a domestic violence or a partner violence situation. We're going to look first at the federal requirements, and Kevin mentioned this early on, OSHA and the General Duty Clause. Basically, the General Duty Clause, and I'm going to actually read how courts have interpreted it because I think it's important to be specific. Courts have interpreted OSHA's General Duty Clause to mean that an employer has a legal obligation to provide a workplace free of conditions or activities that either the employee or industry recognizes as hazardous and that cause or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to employees when there is a feasible method to abate the hazard. Molly, can you go to the next slide? The reason we're focusing on the general duty provision is that OSHA has no specific standard for workplace violence. Therefore, if an employer is going to be held accountable for physical harm or death that's due to workplace violence, it's going to be reviewed by OSHA under the General Duty Clause. That being said, it is expected that OSHA is going to release at some point guidance and standards relative to workplace violence because they're increasing their focus on this as a hazard to the workplace. For example, in 2015, OSHA issued guidance specifically for healthcare and social services workers because they were identified as two very high-risk industries for workplace violence. And in 2019, in actually a Pennsylvania case, a landmark case, OSHA affirmed an administrative law judge's decision that an employer could be held liable under the General Duty Clause for third-party violent acts against employees. So that case was a significant milestone in recognition by OSHA of an employer's responsibility to prevent workplace violence incidents when it is a recognized risk and there is a feasible way to abate that risk. Molly, next page, please. The other thing that's important to note about OSHA and the workplace violence is that they have developed enforcement procedures to be used by their agents when they're when they're doing inspections or issuing citations as it relates to occupational exposure to workplace violence. And they've adopted the NIOSH, or the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health's definition of workplace violence. And the reason that's important is they have categorized for their agents when they're doing their investigations and issuing citations 4 categories of workplace violence, one of those being personal relationships, which includes partner violence. So that's really critical because, again, the guidance is being given to their own agents that this is how workplace violence is defined and should be evaluated. For a victim of partner violence to raise a claim, I'm sorry, Molly, could you go back real quick? For a victim of partner violence to raise a claim under OSHA's general duty clause, they have to prove that there were warning signs of the violent act, that if the company had been paying attention, it would have noticed the warning signs, and that the company could have minimized or prevented the violence. And I just want to note that as far as being a recognized risk, some of the OSHA state laws have acknowledged that personal relationship violence is likely to occur across all industry sectors. So it's difficult for an employer to argue that this is not a recognized risk within their workplace just based on the prevalence of partner violence in our society. Next page, Molly. I'm going to be sensitive to time because I know that we have a hard stop at 8:30. The remote work implications, if anybody has questions regarding this, I would be happy to have a follow-on conversation, because right now OSHA doesn't have specific guidance per se as it relates to remote work. But as Kevin indicated earlier, OSHA's definition of the workplace is really anywhere where work is performed. So we are really encouraging employers for people who are working at home, who don't have the protective environment that they may have in a physical workspace, that you be very conscious and take into consideration the risks for somebody who is working at home, because they tend to be soft targets, and also other mitigating factors like children at home can also influence the risk that somebody might be experiencing in a remote work environment or remote work situation. So even though OSHA doesn't have specific guidance per se around remote work, it does fall within under the general duty clause, and we are strongly encouraging, particularly as we come out of the pandemic and hybrid work situations may become more prevalent, that employers are extremely conscious of not just thinking about the safety in their physical workplaces, but also the safety of their employees who are working remotely. Next slide, Molly. And just to highlight two other potential exposures outside of OSHA, we are seeing a rapid development of state and local regulatory requirements as it relates to partner violence in the workplace. A lot of these have to do with safe leave, but we're also seeing the promulgation of legislation as it relates to making reasonable accommodations to protect the safety of either the victim or that victim's coworkers. We've just cited two examples here from the state of Hawaii and California. And the last thing, and Kevin mentioned this as well, negligence lawsuits can result from an employer's failure to implement adequate safety measures when they are aware of a risk in the workplace. We covered that quickly. So again, we are happy to entertain questions as follow-ups, but I'm going to turn it back over to Beth now.
Thanks so much, Susan. I apologize. It is 9:32, and I recognize that many people will need to move on, but I want to say thank you to Kevin, to Sean, and to Susan for sharing an incredibly rich amount of information that is crucial to employers in preparing their workplace to be as safe as possible. I also wanted to let you know that there was one question in the chat that asked if it's possible to provide webinar attendees with a sample workplace violence policy and employee training. On the Standing Firm website, which we will send to all of you, you will find a best practice policy that you can lift sections of. Many organizations we work with adopt policies, either independent policies around intimate partner violence, or add language to their workplace violence policies that reflects concern and response planning for intimate partner violence. I also wanted to let you know that there is a victim resource guide. There is a sample of our training, our e-learning modules, and there are some available webinars right on the website to help support managers. But I mostly want to say thank you and for paying attention to this crucial issue. Your employee safety, I know, is a priority for all organizations, and we want to be part of the solution. So if there are questions, please, that haven't been answered or that occur to you lately, we will put that, you can put those questions in the comments section of the evaluation that we're going to be sharing very shortly. Thank you all for coming today. We look forward to working with you.